So this was material that I actually presented for the Interchurch Council at Coffs Harbour a couple of weeks ago, beginning of August. But it was worth revisiting, I thought, for our series as well. And it's just an opportunity for us to think through some of the issues about relationships between Christians and Muslims, which and we'll track that a little bit. As many of you will know, of course, I had to say some of this for the lecture in Coffs Harbour. The reason it's a topic that I'm involved in is that I've spent a lot of the last 20 to 30 years travelling to the Middle East, particularly in Israel and Palestine, staying for periods of several weeks or a couple of months, a few months, working there full time as Dean of St George's College for a while, and a lot of my scholarly research activity then, of course, got focused around the questions that come out of that context, and particularly the dig at Bethsaida. And some of that I got involved with, particularly studying the Islamic coins or the Arabic coins that were coming from Bethsaida. So I did some more Arabic studies, and all of that was kind of turned out to be sort of useful background for when we got caught up in the Christchurch terror attack, and the Grafton became a focal point for a lot of media attention. I had a bit of perspective and a bit of background that we could draw on there in a way that was hopefully fairly useful. So I've taken the title Nearest in Affection from this particular surah. Surah would for us would be the equivalent of a chapter. So the Quran is a whole series of surah, and some of them are longer, some of them are shorter. Basically, they're organised by length, so the longest ones come first and the shorter ones come last, so they're not organised by date. We do the same thing, by the way. It's an ancient filing system. The reason that 1 Corinthians is ahead of 2 Corinthians is that 1 Corinthians is longer and 2 Corinthians is shorter. The reasons that Romans is the first of Paul's letters is that it's the longest of Paul's letters, and so on. Okay? So just like in an old-fashioned library, you might find quarto books kept in one section and shorter books. Remember I'm not sure if it's the Cambridge or the Oxford system, they would actually have the shelves at the top were smaller, for smaller books, and as you went down, the shelves got bigger. Now, if you're trying to do consecutive filing of your books, that doesn't work. But if you're actually sorting your books by size, it is more efficient. Okay, you get more books on the wall, but of course that you can't file them consecutively by their catalogue number. It was a similar thing. So in the Old Testament, in the New Testament, in the ancient world, documents were sorted by length. So in the case of what we call 1st and 2nd Corinthians is actually long Corinthians and short Corinthians. 1st and 2nd doesn't mean came first. 1st, 2nd Thessalonians simply means long letter to the Thessalonians, short letter to the Thessalonians. It's not about sequence. It's not about date. And the same with 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, 1 Peter, 2 Peter. Those things are reflecting length of the book, not date of the book. Now, most people don't get that. Most biblical scholars don't get that. And they think that these things refer to that. So in this case, we've got the Surah Al-Ma'idah, and Ma'idah is the word for table. Actually, it's a word for a fancy table, more like a dining table. And so this is one of the surahs, chapter 5, verse 82, and Muhammad is recording this, and you'll find the nearest of them. It's a time when it's a passage where they're talking about other religious communities. You'll find the nearest of them in affection to the believers are those who say we are Christians. Okay, so what's being said here in the Quran by God to Muhammad is that the people who are closest to them are the Christians, the nearest in affection. And why is that? Because among them are priests and monks, and because they are not arrogant. Okay, interesting. So that's a point of view about Christians in the Middle East. We're around about 620 or 630 AD. Okay, so what we're trying to do in this kind of presentation is help people to move from any sense of fear, and there is a lot of fear of Islam, rises from time to time, called Islamophobia, fear of the Muslims. Think about the shared inheritance that we have with Muslims and Jews and Christians, not overlooking our differences. I mean, the things we have in common are really important, but where we differ is what makes us interesting. Okay? So it's good to have lots of things we share, but our uniqueness are the things that make us who we are, make us, make me, and make you. So not overlooking our differences, but recognising that we do actually have a lot in common, and that if we shift our headset a little bit, our mindset, we might find there are lots of ways that Christians and Muslims can collaborate rather than being in fearful, hate-driven competition. And there are many places in the world where the hatred goes both ways, and we have to acknowledge that. So in terms of Muslims in Australia, the story goes back quite a way. Actually, the first Muslims to come to Australia were actually Muslims from Indonesia, and what we would call Indonesia and Malaysia, who traded with the Aborigines on the northwest coast. Now, they didn't try to evangelise them or proselytise them, which is interesting, but the first Muslims to actually come to our country were traders from Southeast Asia, where the Muslim faith had spread some years earlier. If we come to European records, in the census of 1828, obviously in New South Wales, there were 10 Mohammedans listed. Now, Mohammedan is a problematic word. It's Christians who don't understand that Muslims are not worshipping Muhammad. They're not followers of Muhammad. They're worshipping God. Okay? But from a European perspective, one of the labels we've used for Islam is that we speak about them as Mohammedans, followers of Muhammad. And that's a term of abuse, really. But not surprisingly, that's what was being recorded by whoever it was from the New South Wales Corps who was recording the census data. There were 10 Mohammedans amongst the people living in Sydney town in 1828. What's that, 40 years after white settlement. Indeed, the first non-Indigenous person in the Clarence Valley was a guy called Sheikh Brown, and he was in the Nimboida area. He was a frequent runaway convict from Moreton Bay and anywhere else where they locked him up. But this particular instance, he escaped from Moreton Bay again, made his way down here. Okay, the highway was terrible at the time, but he made his way down here and spent a couple of years, around about 1835, living in this area, up around Nimboida. And then when he handed himself in, at the end of that time at Port Macquarie, he was let off leniently because of the intelligence he gave the government about timber and mineral resources up this big river. It was just a little bit further north. So he kind of got some leverage out of his escapades. Now, he was an Indian Muslim. He'd found his way to London as part of the British Empire, got into trouble with the authorities, was sentenced to death, but instead was transported to Sydney, was always in trouble. They put him up in Brisbane, where the bad people go, and he kept escaping, and actually eventually came to grief at the hands of the Indigenous people because of some way he was treating some of their women. Then in the late 1800s, we have the Afghan camel drivers who were brought in to help with the economic development of the outback and to use camels. So that's probably the first substantial, almost intentional wave of migration of Muslim people into Australia. And this is before we invented the White Australia policy. It wasn't a problem. And everybody came by boat, so boat people weren't a problem. Except from the point of view of the Indigenous, who thought all of us really should go back where we came from. Okay. But after Federation, Australia introduced the White Australia policy, which excluded non-European Muslims. But there were still Muslims coming, but they were coming from the Balkans, from Eastern Europe. So they weren't they weren't migrating from the Middle East or from Southeast Asia, from Afghanistan and so on. So the Muslims who were coming were small in number, few in number, I should say, and they were Europe. They were still Europeans, and being European was more important at the time than being Catholic or Protestant or Christian or Muslim or Jewish or whatever. Had to be white. Don't care what your religion is as long as you're white. Okay, that was the policy right down until basically the early 1970s. Okay, we got a bit more subtle. We had tests of English literacy and so on, but basically it was still a white Australia policy. From 1975, we moved to a supposedly non-discriminatory immigration policy, and lots of Lebanese came. Interesting, the Lebanese were 60% Christian and 40% Muslim. And that's not, if you ask people about the Lebanese, they'll say they're Muslims. Actually, these days they're probably more 50-50, but there's a very large Lebanese Muslim association in Sydney. It's one of the major Islamic groups, and it's because it gets a lot of media attention. But the other part of the sort of Lebanese migration are people like, say, Joe Hockey's parents, and one of the previous premiers of New South Wales was from Lebanese background as well. It doesn't mean they were Muslim, it just meant they were Lebanese Australians. In the 1990s, we moved to an even more open and inclusive policy in terms of migration and refugees. We've shrunk back from it a bit, but that's more or less the default setting officially at the moment. And so we officially do not discriminate against anybody on the basis of them being a Muslim or a Hindu or whatever it turns out to be. There was a little reverse discrimination exercise in 2016, you might remember, and the government announced that it would take an extra 20,000 Syrian refugees provided they were Christian Syrians or Christian Iraqis. And that was an aberration. Normally, we wouldn't be basing our immigration on religion. So that's been the kind of the history of the history of sort of Islamic coming in. That's somebody trying to FaceTime me, would you believe? But hopefully it'll just give up. Let's look at the census data. So 2016 nationally, there were 604,000 Muslims out of 24 million or something. Okay, so we haven't been swamped, despite some of the headlines. 2.2% of the population, 2.6%, 5 years earlier was 2.2%. This is not a massive torrent of people flooding into the country. Okay. Locally in the Clarence Valley, at the same time, there were 43 Muslims. That's why it was so hard to make contact with any of them after March. In the whole Clarence Valley, out of almost 51,000 people, there were 43 Muslims, according to the census. Many of them, of course, are medical specialists who are here short term, but they're the local GP, they're working in the hospital and so on. They're working as podiatrists and so on in the healthcare industry. That's 0.08%. Okay, but this, as we know from other times, we live in a very Anglo community. Well, the Muslims are tiny little percentage. And at Coffs Harbour, because this lecture was really given down there, at the same time, the statistical district has 73,000 people. There were 466 Muslims there in 2016. So there's a bit more capacity to get some community services targeted at their needs, because there's enough of them to kind of deal with. But even so, it's still only 0.6% of the population in the Coffs Harbour statistical district. Okay, so yes, they're here. There are actually more Muslims in Australia than Jews, but the Jews tend to be in high prestige occupations, and Muslims are divided between very highly professionalised health work and I guess lots of other occupations that are not so highly regarded. Now, changing focus, that's kind of what we've been looking at, is kind of the historical and the current scene of Muslims in Australia. The next slide, I just want to look at some of the historical dates for Islam and Christianity and Judaism. So I'm going to go right back to Abraham, because Abraham is the the character out of the scriptures who all three religions say he's our granddaddy. You know, we come from him. That's kind of the story. And we often refer to the Abrahamic religions, meaning Judaism, Christianity and Islam. So Abraham, or Ibrahim, of course, for the Muslims. Now, in the biblical narrative, if you're trying to put a date on Abraham, which I think is the wrong thing to do, and you can't actually, but if you were trying to put a date on Abraham, you'd go somewhere around 2000 BC. Okay? The dates in the textbooks range between 2200 and 1800 BC. So that's a 400-year window. But we have no idea about any historical character behind this. The next character who pops up who's significant in the traditions is Moses, Moshe in Hebrew, and of course Musa in Arabic. And again, you can hear the commonality across the languages. Okay, roughly 1300. Again, there are various dates, and there's significant reasons to think Moses didn't exist. But on the biblical narrative, there's about a 700-year gap between Abraham and Moses. That's a long time. Okay, think back 700 years from now. What was England like 700 years ago? Okay, there were no Europeans in North America 700 years ago. The world was a totally different place. Just a couple of hundred years later, we get David and Solomon coming into the story, Daud and Suleiman, Ibn Daud, Solomon, the son of David. Almost, 900 years later, more or less, we get to Easter, to the death of Jesus, who in the Quran is known as Issa, which is actually very close to the Greek Yesu. Okay, the same kind of word is coming through. Issa ibn Maryam, Jesus, son of Mary. Muhammad himself lived on our calendar, between 570 and 632. So we lived about 60 years. 62 years, okay? Which actually is not bad for the ancient world, the medieval world, okay? Must have been pretty healthy. Well, several of them. And also, despite being a warrior as well, because, warriors are more exposed to risk. So the dates for Muhammad, the revelation of the earliest surahs from the Quran around 610, okay? So they're not remember in the Quran, they're organised by length, not by date. The flight to Medina, to the city of Medina, what's called the Hijrah, happens in 622. And Muhammad himself is going to die 10 years later. Now, Muslim dates, Islamic dates, are dated from the time of the Hijrah. So there's about, as you can see, a 622-year difference between our calendar and their calendar. We also also theirs is a solar calendar and ours is a lunar calendar. So it's not just as simple as that. The length of the years is different as well. So there's special tables to help us work that out. 637, 15 years after the Hijrah, Jerusalem surrenders to Omar the Caliph, the successor of the Prophet, and so up until that time, for the previous 400 years or so, Jerusalem had been a Christian city. And it still is a Christian city, but it's under Islamic rule from this point on. And slowly, population becomes more Muslim than Christian. Okay? And the last date to look at, just in terms of the series, is that roughly 400 years later, 450 years later, the First Crusade recaptures Jerusalem. But the whole Crusader period only lasts about 100 years, 100 to 150 years, and was never as successful later on as in its first iteration. So you get a sense. So there's basically 3,000 years of tradition, from 2000 BC to about 1000 AD, and the story of the children of Abraham, the Abrahamic faith, is kind of being played out through that period, and we could overlay some Jewish dates there as well. So, early reactions to Islam from the West. Well, the first thing to note is that Islam developed in the Middle East in areas which were beyond the borders of the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine Empire is what became the Roman Empire, basically from Constantine onwards. So you've got a sort of Greek-speaking Roman Empire, Christian Empire, centred in Byzantium or Constantinople, what today we call Istanbul. Okay? And their great enemies were the Parthians or the Persians further to the east, and the Arabs were the tribes sort of in between, and both empires were trying to use them to attack the other side. Okay? So Islam developed outside of the empire and in that random kind of space where they were the free agents. They also reflect, because Islam didn't grow up in a vacuum. There were Jewish communities throughout the Middle East, beyond the Byzantine borders, and there were large Christian communities in the area as well, but they were not part of the Roman Byzantine Empire. Therefore, they were not part of the Council of Nicaea. They were not part of the Council of Chalcedon. And so the Byzantine Christians just regarded all the Oriental Christians as heretics because they didn't sign up to the councils, which were called by the Roman Emperor, because they weren't under the authority of the Roman Emperor. Okay? Now, generally speaking, the Oriental Christians didn't have the sophisticated Trinitarian theology that had been hammered out the Council of Nicaea and the Council of Chalcedon. So their Christology, we might say, was a bit more rudimentary, not as developed. And interestingly, the theology and the Christology of Islam is actually very similar to the theology of these Oriental Christians, where they were nervous to talk about the Jesus as God. Okay, they had a different take on some of that stuff. I've already mentioned what was going on initially was that the Arabic forces, long before Muhammad, were being used by both the Persians and also the Byzantines, and they began to make inroads into the southern and southeastern corners of the Byzantine Empire, and posing a political and military threat to the Christian Empire. Interestingly, when the Muslims captured Jerusalem and Jerusalem surrenders to Omar, from the point of view of the local people living in Jerusalem, they had been liberated. It was like the Boston Tea Party. They were getting rid of this taxation requirement from Byzantium, and they thought they were going to be free. They were going to liberate themselves from the heavy weight of the empire. And when Omar takes over the city, he allows a window of a couple of weeks when the Romans, meaning the Byzantines, when the Romani were allowed to leave the city, but they could take their lives, but they could not take any property or money with them. So they were given free passage. So the Byzantine officials were given safe passage to leave the territory because they were not welcome either by the locals or by the new owners. There's a classic story when you visit the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, and right next to it is the Mosque of Omar. Why is that mosque there? We tend to see it as an affront. Look, they built a mosque right next to the church. Well, in the legend, Omar captures the city. The patriarch, the Greek patriarch, surrenders the city to Omar because the patriarch was the ruler of the city. He invites Omar to come into the Church of the Resurrection, as they call it, which was a massive, fantastic, government-funded cathedral, okay, funded by all the money the Roman Empire could supply. And Omar declines and says, if I go and pray in that church, my followers will knock it down and build a mosque there. He said, I'll pray outside. And that's where the Mosque of Omar was built. So it's actually a sign of coexistence. It's not a sign of confrontation. Okay? But lots of people visit, why did they put a mosque so close to the church? Because they chose not to come inside, because it could complicate the future. Indeed, throughout the Middle East, as it gradually came under Islamic rule, most of the population was Christian. They didn't just convert, they stayed Christian. Okay? Many of the government officials were Christian. It was just that the top echelon the jobs were controlled by the Muslims. So the point I was just making, really, the Christians continued to flourish through the caliphate, and indeed they were doing so well that it was at this time that the Christians in the Middle East began to call themselves Arabs. But they're not Arabs. Arabs come from Arabia. These are people from Lebanon, Palestine, Egypt. They're not Arabs. But if you ask any of my friends in Palestine who are not Jewish, they will say, I'm an Arab. In other words, they adopted Arabic identity and Arabic language. They stopped using Aramaic and translated the Bible from Aramaic into Arabic, translated the liturgy into Arabic, and they translated the scientific and medical and architectural texts of the Greek and Roman Empire into Arabic, where it became the cultural milieu and inheritance of Islam, who gave it back to Europe at the time of the Renaissance and sort of subsequently. So there's a whole other story of the Christian-Muslim interaction in the Middle East. That's not to say that there wasn't an economic and a social advantage in becoming a Muslim. Okay? Just as there was an economic and social advantage in becoming an Anglican during the British Mandate in Palestine. You got more government jobs if you belong to the church. Okay, or Catholics if you're in Lebanon. Okay, so Christian responses to Islam. One of the responses we often hear is that people see Islam as a deviant and heretical sect, that they once had a Christian legacy, but they've chosen to go off the rails and become this deviant, heretical religious movement. Now that's a perspective on Islam coming from Europe, and it doesn't reflect the historical origins of Islam at all. But it's one that is certainly around in lots of quarters. Whether or not they're seen as a deviant and heretical sect, the Muslim world, certainly during the time of the European colonial expansion, Muslims were seen as objects of missionary activity. So Christian missionaries went to what is now Pakistan and still go there to try and convert Muslims to Christians. Okay, similar things happening in parts of Africa and so on. And Africa is an interesting point because until very recently, Islam only spread down a certain distance, about equivalent to halfway through Sudan, and the rest of the continent, Islam didn't spread. Why? Because of the tsetse fly, which was bad for traders. So they just didn't go any further south. So the south became colonised by Europeans, mostly converted to Christianity. So the southern half of Africa is solidly Christian. The north half of Africa is solidly Muslim. In places like Nigeria, they're going head to head and they're killing each other.
Right now?
Yeah, still now. Okay? Why? Because the Christians are trying to convert Muslims in northern Nigeria, and the Muslims are trying to convert Christians in southern Nigeria to take on their faith. Okay? And that's part of the tension between South Sudan and Sudan as well. Okay, so it's not necessarily a happy story, and both religions are in fact missionary religions. Christians and Muslims feel we have an obligation to spread the word and to convince other people to join us. Now, Jews don't do that. Jews are not interested in converting the rest of the world to Judaism. Hindus are not interested in evangelizing the rest of the world and making them Hindu. Muslims and Christians we share this common mindset that we've got the good news and you need to accept it. And we both use various tricks to persuade peasants to come on board with our product. Education for their children, hospitals, all the things missionaries do. Why do we build hospitals, run schools? Because we want to persuade the people to become Christian. Okay, and Muslims do the same. Then, of course, there's the situation of Christian minorities in majority Muslim countries or societies. This is, of course, it became the norm in the Middle East. Over time, the Christian communities shrank and the Muslim community population grows and becomes the norm. And so then you find also laws being introduced to control the other, to control the minority. So, for example, in Malaysia today, no church building can have a spire or a roof which is higher than the local mosque. Okay, because there's a preference in the town planning laws for Islam, because Islam is the majority religion in Malaysia and so on. So you find these kind of things happening for the last 800 years or so, once Muslims become the majority.
I think there was a case in Indonesia, wasn't it, where there was a Christian wanting to run as mayor for the...
Yeah.
For
Just
years.
extremely recently, and so you get tensions there when a community assumes that because their religion is a majority of the population, therefore the nation has to reflect that. Now that's a view of the character of the nation, which in the West for the last couple of hundred years we have stepped back from, but we still hear people talking about Australia as being Australia's a Christian country. Or so, for instance, in the 19th century, when England was at its peak in terms of world power, they negotiated with the Sultan to build a large Anglican church in downtown in Cairo. And the agreement was that any time you want to, you can build a mosque in Hyde Park in London. Ha ha ha, that will never happen. Guess what? The President of Egypt has cashed that cheque, and they now have a mosque right in the heart of London, which is well attended because there are now lots of Muslims living in London. Okay, but at the time we presumed that European Christianity would always conquer, but it hasn't. Okay, so these communities have learned to live within their own bubble, and so, for example, the outside of a Greek Orthodox church in the former Ottoman Empire looks very plain. You walk inside, it's spectacular. Well, why is it plain on the outside? Because it would be offensive to the Muslims to have religious art on the outside of the mosque, on the outside of the church. So you keep it on the inside and so on. Okay, so they've had hundreds of years of practice living as Christians in a community which is basically Muslim. I've already mentioned this point where we've got new fields of expansion in East Africa and West Africa, where traditionally Muslims haven't been present, but Christians are now increasingly present. We of course get head-to-head religious competition. The colonial expansion by the Europeans really changed the deck. Until then, the Islamic Empire basically controlled from North Africa around to Turkey, perhaps into the Balkans to some extent. Russia was in the north, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire was in Eastern Europe, and beyond that the French and the Germans, the Italians were always fighting each other with the English, coming in periodically to stir the pot and make it more difficult. But with the advent of industrial progress and sort of maritime exploration, European people began to come into contact with other parts of the world, including Muslim communities, of course India, mostly Hindu, and China. And the assumption was, if I can send a gunboat there, then I can do it. We don't like it when China reverses that, but that was the assumption. We have the gunboats, we can go anywhere we want, we are white people, we are Christians. Okay. Now that led to a destabilization of the Islamic world, because for the best part of 1,000 years, Islam had been on an expansionary trajectory. Suddenly they were being pushed aside by European Christians, which is a profound cultural challenge to their own view of themselves. And we're now seeing some of the pushback. There's a delay, but when we talk about sort of radical Islam, it's partly a response to the cultural shaming caused by European expansion, colonial expansion. That doesn't validate it, it just means we can understand the processes that are going on here. You pushed my grandfather around and he wasn't strong enough to say no, but I'm not going to take it, kind of thing. And then, of course, the other thing, and we've again touched on that as well with the story about Egypt, partly because of the European colonialism, lots of people from the empire came back to London or Brussels or Paris or wherever. So they get substantial non-European and also Muslim populations in different places around the country, around Europe. And that brings a whole other dynamic to Muslim-Christian relationships. Okay, so let's talk about the modern tensions. Way back, long time ago, 1979. Who could remember 1979? I had long, dark, curly hair. The Iranian Revolution, Ayatollah Khomeini, and all that meant, and particularly the capture of the American embassy and the holding of the American embassy staff as hostages in the dying days of the presidency of Carter. Okay, so that's when we began to pay attention to radical Islam, resurgent Islam, and notice how they're really the same thing, but if we say resurgent Islam, it has a different feel to it than radical Islam. And yet it's really talking about the same dynamic. And then throughout many parts of the Muslim world, local nationalists moved away from secular nationalism, which was sort of, say, Nasser in Egypt and Arafat in Palestine and so on, and instead of being secular nationalists, following more or less a European model of Egypt for the Egyptians, Palestine for the Palestinians, Syria for the Syrians, Germany for the Germans, whatever, they began to say, we are Muslims, and our country has to be a Muslim Egypt, and so on. So you get the rise of Hamas displacing the PLO, for example, in terms of the Israel-Palestine struggle. And we've seen that through Indonesia, through Malaysia, through parts of southern Philippines, and so on. Nationalist movements become also expressions of radical Islam, but it's a cultural sort of movement, political movement, as much as anything else. Remember the first Gulf War, between the Iranian Revolution and the Gulf War, which is basically about 10 to 20 years, 10 to 15 years, America was happy to be allied with Hassan and the Iraqis, and to foster an ongoing war between Iraq and Iran. And Iraq were our allies, remember? And then Iraq decided, for whatever crazy reason, to go and capture Kuwait, and then everything went bad. Suddenly the war with Iran was off, and the war with the West was on. So we had the first Gulf War. And around that time, we get this upsurge of Islamophobia. Women on public transport being attacked because of their headscarves and so on. Mosques being attacked, and etc. So we have a series of events. The first Gulf War, and then ultimately, of course, the second Gulf War. We have the attack of 9/11, the struggle against Al-Qaeda with the Afghanistan war, and then ongoing sectarian violence when the West went in and finally flattened Iraq. What that led to, as we all saw, was a terrible collapse of security and sectarian rivalry between different groups of people in Iraq. And out of all that, of course, eventually comes ISIS, and of course with the so-called caliphate. So that's been very much the dominant story for the last 20 years in the Middle East. Okay? And it's about politics and so on, and yet it has also flowered or flowed over into a fear of Islam and a fear of Muslims in the West. Not least because the violence is not contained to Baghdad. The violence pops up in Bali and in the Twin Towers and in Paris and other places. And as we've seen in Christchurch in New Zealand, the violence can go both ways as well. So we have violence against Western Muslims as well as violence against Western targets perpetrated by Muslims. In France, the legislation to ban the hijab, for example, to try having been involved for a couple of hundred years in a colonial project in North Africa, lots of Algerians and others coming to France. Suddenly we don't want people like you here because it's making us feel unsafe. Okay? So we can understand the tensions that are going on. And one of the expressions of that in the West has been that political candidates who speak against immigration, often clothed in terms of we need to protect Western values, We need to protect Christian civilization, okay, which really means we don't want Muslims coming to our country. That's the subtext for a lot of that stuff. And we've seen how popular some of those parties can be. So we have violence by Muslims against Westerners and, of course, violence against Muslims by Westerners. So I want you to look at this photo for a moment. This is a photo inside Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem. What do you make of that window in Al-Aqsa Mosque? Does it look familiar? Does it look very Islamic? Looks kind of like one of our windows, right? It's a rose window. It's a Christian Gothic window from a Western cathedral, and it's right up near the front of Al-Aqsa Mosque. And if you look below it, there's a very different kind of window which looks much more Middle Eastern, much more Islamic, much more Arabic in its culture. Okay, so that's a story in itself. But during the time of the Crusades, the Dome of the Rock and the sort of adjacent Al-Aqsa Mosque were taken over and turned into Christian churches. So remember the story of Omar? He wouldn't walk inside the church in case it was turned into a mosque or demolished. When the Crusaders arrived, they deliberately took over the Dome of the Rock and renamed it as the Church of the Holy Trinity, which could not be more insulting to the Muslims. Okay? And amongst other things, we find some of their architecture surviving to this day in the Al-Aqsa Mosque. So let's think about some of the ways we might rethink Christian views of Islam. The first point to make is that the one God worshipped by Jews, Christians and Muslims is the God that Muslims call Allah. And if you're an Arabic-speaking Christian, Allah is the name for God. Okay? They don't have another word for God. This is the word for God. And it's closely related to the Hebrew word El and Eloah and Elohim, which are the same basic letters, which is the Hebrew word for God. So one of the points for us to get our head around is that we are all worshipping the same God. Now, not every Christian would agree with that statement, but I want to suggest that's a fundamental point if we're going to be in any kind of positive relationship with Muslims. We understand God differently, but then we understand God differently from Jews, and we insist we're worshipping the same God as the Old Testament, although, of course, the Jewish people would say, no, you're not, because for you, Jesus is part of God, and for us, he's not. You've changed God into something else. And we say to the Muslims, no, you're not worshipping the same God as us because you left Jesus out. Okay? But we are all claiming to worship the same God, the creator of the universe, the one who's known through the tradition in the Bible and so on. But we understand God differently. But then Christians understand God differently from each other as well. The phrase, thy kingdom come, of course, for us is a really precious phrase coming out of the Lord's Prayer. But actually it represents the very heart of Islam. The word Islam means submission. In other words, submitting to God's will. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as in heaven. The Lord's Prayer could be prayed by a Muslim and they would not have the slightest reason to disagree with any of the sentiments anywhere in the Lord's Prayer. They don't say it because it's seen as a Christian prayer, but the Lord's Prayer could be said by a Jew or by a Muslim there's nothing distinctively Christian about the Lord's Prayer. So our prayer for the kingdom to come and for God's will to be done on earth is the same prayer that a Muslim makes when he says, God, I submit to your will. Show me what you want done. Okay? We're making the same request of God. Interestingly, creation for Muslims as with Christians, creation comes from God and humans are seen as the stewards of creation. And I put in the word Khalifa there, which is actually the word Caliph. But in the original meaning of Khalifa, it means somebody who's a steward, somebody who's a trustee, somebody who's a custodian on behalf of somebody else. Okay? So in the Islamic tradition, humans are Khalifa. We are the trustees of creation on behalf of Allah. Oh, we don't have any problem with that. That's exactly how we understand being made in the image of God and being responsible to be nurturers of God's creation. Muslims and Christians and Jews all create communities of practice, congregations, where we pray, we study the scriptures, we value family life, we encourage people to be generous and charitable, and we appreciate the value of pilgrimage. Now, we go to different places, but pilgrimage, of course, is part of Islam, it's part of Christianity, and it's always been part of the religious experience of Jews, because if they could, they would try to get to Jerusalem or to Eretz Israel at some stage during their life. But if you think about that, what we're trying to do in the little communities of faith we form, whether it's an Anglican parish or a Muslim mosque or a Jewish synagogue, we're doing the same thing. Now, we have different ways of expressing it, different traditions, different rituals, but we're trying to do the same thing. We're people of prayer, we're people who study scripture, we value our families, we encourage people to be charitable, and we value pilgrimage. And we have very similar views on the afterlife. Indeed, for Muslims, where Jesus comes back into the story is that Jesus is the judge of the world at the end of time, not Muhammad. Okay? For Muslims, Jesus is the one who will be the judge of everybody at the end of time. He's not God, but he's the one who God has appointed to be the judge on Judgment Day. Okay? So this sense of ultimate cosmic accountability with and sharing eternal life with the compassionate one. So when we think about the core beliefs of Muslims and Christians, yes, we have our differences around the Bible versus the Quran and about how we speak about Jesus, because they also call Jesus the Word of God, okay? And they certainly take the virgin birth stories very seriously and very literally, more so than most of us would do. But we have differences around Jesus, the divinity of Jesus, and of course we get upset when the Bible gets replaced by the Quran. Okay? But other than that, there's not a huge amount of difference between Muslims and Christians. So my suggestion is that we could develop an agenda for affection where we see that one of the things that Muslims and Christians and other people could be doing is to actually work hard together to strengthen the multi-faith character of Australia, to make it more resilient and more acceptable that we are a multi-faith society. We're one of the most multicultural societies in history and on the planet. And that's something that both Christians and Muslims have a stake in. Okay? We don't want that to become polarised or nasty. At the local level, and it's difficult to do when there are 43,000 Christians and 43 Muslims, it's a bit hard to have a conversation. Okay, 1,000 Christians take one Muslim over here and have a little respectful conversation. That's not going to happen, right? But overall, in the country as a whole and in larger centres, we could be developing local interfaith relations so we're not strangers to each other, so that when the next problem pops up, the next thing like Christchurch happens, we're not strangers. And the local Muslims will feel absolutely comfortable coming straight to the cathedral and say, can we have some prayers? Because look, some really bad things have happened, or vice versa. One of the things that happened in Sri Lanka, when they had their attacks about, a month after the Christchurch attacks, they were mostly Catholic churches which were attacked. In one case, the local Muslim mosque said to the Catholics, come and have Mass in our mosque. Think about that. A Christian Eucharist, Catholic Mass, being celebrated inside a mosque. One of the things Muslims will be most offended by. They said, look, your church has been blown to smithereens, come and use our building. And there are stories like that all around the world where Christians have made human chains around mosques to protect them from attack, and where Muslims have made human chains around churches to protect them from the attacks by the radicals. Okay? we can't afford to be strangers, because when the bad time comes, it's too late. Obviously, we want to work on social harmony. I think that's one of the roles the Cathedral can really develop here in Grafton, because the more social harmony there is, the more Christians and Muslims will also be happily together, along with the Sikhs and the Hindus and whoever else. Education, I think, again, is something we can do together. And there was a couple of years ago now in southeast Queensland, there was a project where, it sounds like a joke, but there was a Muslim, a Jew and a Christian, okay? They didn't go into a pub, they went into a school and another school and another school and another school. And they ran programs helping kids in the school to understand the relationship, the history and the character of Judaism, Christianity and Islam. And by seeing the rabbi, the imam and the priest together, obviously friends, the kids got it. We're different, but we can work together. So there needs to be education within schools, both religious schools and secular schools. We need to be educating our own people to be more tolerant and less anxious. And of course, there has to be a voice to wider society. I already mentioned that in the Islamic faith tradition, humans are seen as the Khalifa, the trustee, the stewards of creation. And again, this is an area of incredible significance to the human race and indeed to the planet. I mean, the fires going on in the Amazon at the moment, the impact of losing the Amazon jungle in terms of the Earth's air quality, I mean, it's just mind-boggling. It doesn't just affect Catholics living in South America. It doesn't just affect even humans. It affects every creature that needs oxygen. And that's, a lot of us need oxygen. Surely that's somewhere where Muslims and Christians have a natural capacity to work together. Once we stop arguing about whether women should have scarves or whatever. Compassion and social justice. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, one of the things we share is that we believe God is compassionate and we believe God wants us to be compassionate. And there's certainly scope for Muslims and Christians to work together in the areas of social justice. That can be responding to some sort of humanitarian crisis, or it can just be responding to issues of social justice, which in Australia's context, of course, includes children in detention, the treatment of asylum seekers and so on. And increasingly, while we've tended to see humanitarian aid as something Christians do, and even the Red Cross, Red Cross, okay, now there's the Red Crescent as well. And they work together effectively as one organisation, in other words, and then there's World Muslim Aid and so on. So increasingly, Muslims and Christians are working together in places. One of my friends in Brisbane used to work for World Vision. I think he's working for them again now. He spent a couple of years as a parish priest. One of his projects was developing a group of clergy, pick me sort of thing. I love to do this sort of work. Where there's been a crisis and maybe the place has been wiped out by a tsunami or whatever, the first wave of responders, they reconnect the water, remove the dead bodies and so on. But actually the cultural and value system of the community has been trashed as well. And they need help to re-establish their moral and spiritual structures. And so we're looking at developing, basically the working name was something like Chaplains Without Borders. But it was basically a team of religious leaders who would be recognised. You go into a place that might be totally Muslim, you'd be dressed like this, so they know you're a Christian, but they respect that, okay, because they recognise you as an imam, sort of. The job being to help the local Muslim community re-establish the schools and the mosque and the educational programs for their children to pick up the pieces and not have a generation that have gone through with no moral training, no exposure to the best teaching. So it's not just money and development, it's also spiritual aid and to help a Muslim community or a Hindu community, whatever, to rebuild their moral and spiritual fabric would be something that we could be doing together. Violence against women and violence against other vulnerable persons. The church has a great track record here, as we know, at the Royal Commission into sexual abuse of children and all the other cases of abuse, okay? And we tend to think that women do it really tough in the Islamic world. I don't need to tell the women in the room how tough it can be just to be a woman walking down the street in any Australian town or city, okay? I can go places of a night time with very little fear because I'm a bloke. If I was a woman, I'd be much more careful about where I went, okay? That's really not a problem in a Muslim community. The women will be safe, okay? So there's a whole balancing of issues there, isn't there? But we have much to learn. And one of my favourite recent stories, when I was in Sydney a few months ago, I met up with a Muslim woman that I'd been interacting with after the Christchurch massacre. She picked me up after a meeting at Parliament House or whatever, and we went to a nice restaurant just under the Sydney Harbour Bridge at the Rocks. She's in her hijab, and I'm dressed in my black clericals. We walk into the restaurant together. Wow. We go across and sit down, we order, we're laughing and joking, having a lovely time for an hour or so. I mean, what we were demonstrating that a religious Christian and a religious Muslim woman can be together, having a time, enjoying each other's company, having a lovely night out, and it was just no big deal for us, okay? But it would have been, I would love to know what the other people in this very swanky restaurant, which I couldn't have afforded to go to, what they were thinking. So I'm sure there's work we can do together, and there'll be some things we can't do together. Okay? Some of our attitudes around gender and so on may just not be compatible, but we've got to find where those spots are and not just avoid them. And I think the last thing is this point of, in our kind of world, as we become more and more high-tech, as the surveillance cameras get smarter and smarter, as they have done in China, and they will do here, as the algorithms take over, okay, what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be a carbon-based life form in a digital world, okay? And I think that's where, again, that's an area where Muslims and Christians and Jews and other people of faith have a lot to add. What is the ancient spiritual wisdom about being human? And how do we contribute that into a world that's becoming dehumanized? So, wrapping up, a couple of years ago now, not all that long ago, there was a document put out by a group of Muslim leaders called A Common Word. And I'll just read it out. It's too many words to look at on the screen. Finding common ground between Muslims and Christians is not simply a matter for polite ecumenical dialogue between selected religious leaders. It has been a hobby for church leaders. Christianity and Islam are the largest and the second largest religions in the world and in history. Christians and Muslims reportedly make up over a third and over a fifth of humanity, respectively. Together, they make up more than 55% of the world's population, making the relationship between these two religious communities the most important factor in contributing to meaningful peace around the world. If Muslims and Christians are not at peace, the world cannot be at peace. With the terrible weaponry of the modern world, with Christians and Muslims intertwined everywhere as never before, no side can unilaterally win a conflict between more than half of the world's inhabitants. Thus, our common future is at stake. The very survival of the world itself is perhaps at stake. That's written by 20 or 30, whatever it was, a large group of some of the most respected Islamic scholars in the world as a word to the Christian community. So let our differences not cause hatred and strife between us. Let us vie with each other only in righteousness and good works. Let's be competitive about the good stuff. Who can pray more? Who can give more charity? Who can, whatever. Let's have that sort of competition. Let us respect each other, be fair, just and kind to one another, and live in sincere peace, harmony and mutual goodwill. Would you like to see a world like that? And this is just their, again, this is coming from the Quran, from Surah Ali Imran. O people of the book, that's Christians and Jews, let us come to a common word between us.